Welcome back to the Trauma Docu-Series. I'm Dr. Pedram Shojai, New York Times bestselling author and filmmaker of several films and series focused on health and wellness.
And I'm Nick Palizzi, founder of The Sacred Science and producer of several documentaries and docu-series. In our first episode, we learned about two different types of trauma, big T trauma and little t trauma, and how both have lasting effects on our physical and mental well-being.
Today, we're going to hear powerful stories from two survivors of very different kinds of traumatic events. We'll explore the emotional effects trauma has on us, not just mentally, but on a cellular level. Trauma literally changes the way our brains work, and it changes our behavior.
We're going to look at PTS or PTSD, post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder, and how the echoes of traumatic events can alter your entire life.
Behavioral disorders associated with trauma can create a ripple effect of additional traumatic events, not just for the person who suffered the initial trauma, but for those around them as well.
If left unchecked, behavioral disorders associated with trauma can lead to a rapid downward spiral.
Perhaps the hardest part of taking control of your trauma is recognizing a behavioral disorder as a symptom of a traumatic event. Making that connection is the first step towards a cure. Nick's now going to start us on a journey of recognizing trauma, understanding it, and working through it towards a post-traumatic life filled with growth and higher purpose.
We begin with the story of Andrew Marr, an ex-Special Forces soldier with a story that's difficult to hear. Up until recently, soldiers who experienced combat and returned home with emotional or behavioral issues were just chalked up to having shell shock or battle fatigue. Today, we recognize the mental, physical, and neurological damage our soldiers endure in the line of duty, and it's saving lives. Andrew's journey of recovery is both enlightening and inspiring, and we're fortunate to have him share his story with us.
I was in so much pain, was causing so much pain amongst my family. We like when you find out you have a brain injury, like that's an incredibly difficult period. It's like, oh my God, like what do you mean I have an injured brain? Like what does that mean? You know, like we weren't really getting a lot of answers back then. So I'm on all this medication, like I'm this tip of the spear, you know, high performer to somebody who can't even function anymore or remember how to drive home. And, you know, I was just, you know, I would come to, and it was apparent that I had just been like, you know, yelling at one of my kids and coming to and just seeing like a look of horror in their face and not really understanding like what just happened. But it just became apparent to me like, hey man, I think life would be better for everybody here if like I just removed myself from the equation.
So when we experience PTSD, it can be either from a big T or a little t trauma. But what happens is inside of our brains, we have a system called the limbic system, or our emotional system of our brains. And it's a system of our brains that is shared with all mammals. And in the center of the limbic system, in the center of our brains, there is an area called the amygdala. So when the amygdala fires, it creates this alarm in our brains that feels life-threatening. And when that happens, we aren't able to store memories in our hippocampus where they belong.
I would go through these, you know, I had this uncontrollable rage, just uncontrollable. And when it would come on, I would just go upstairs in our closet in our bedroom, and I would lock myself in the closet. And I would just stay there in the fetal position, you know, sometimes hours at a time. And I thought like, I can't go on like this, you know what I mean? And so that's, you know, I would take my gun with me and I'd put it in my mouth and I, you know, really thought about it. I didn't want, you know, I thought like, you know, one of my kids are gonna have to come in here and find me, or it's gonna be my wife, and, you know, live through situations like that with other people. And I just didn't want it playing out that way. And when I could turn my focus from one of just focusing on the suffering to redirect that and to focus that on improving my situation. And it wasn't just as easy as flipping that switch. Like, when I was able to channel that pain into something productive, it allowed me to own it, and at the same time to remove any barrier between me and what I thought was healing or a healed individual. In my mind, I just saw myself as somebody who was better, and I didn't know what the answer was, but I was confident that we would go out and find it.
When a memory is stored in the amygdala, what happens is it's stored in the eternal now, because the amygdala is such a rudimentary system, it's not able to encode for time. So in response to this potential threat, our amygdala fires and it recalls all the memories of the trauma. And it feels like the trauma is happening now because the amygdala can't store for the past time signature. It's only the eternal now. So PTSD is when we think that that old scary thing is happening right in this moment when there's nothing actually scary happening.
We'd had a number of guys in Special Forces who had killed themselves, and we just couldn't fathom, like, why on earth people in our community would do something like that. And so I never understood it, like, why they chose to take their own lives. It wasn't until I got to the point where I seriously was contemplating taking my own, where I understood, like, oh my God, like, this is the spiral, because you think it's only affecting you and you're the only person, like, living through this when you're going through it. When you're able to take a step out of yourself for a moment, you kind of start to understand. I was like, okay, well, this is the problem. This is the process, man. And so that really made me interested on, like, what was causing, all these changes in my personality and my behavior and all the symptoms I was experiencing.
I have veterans who come in who have never had a scratch on their body, but they were exposed to blast wave trauma, whether or not it was an IED or an RPG or one of those explosive devices that led to them being hit by this blast wave, which travels rapidly, and never had loss of consciousness. But over the course of time, they develop symptoms.
So I think in large part, and the science supports this, is that a lot of people who are suffering heavily from depression, anxiety, or a major mood disorder could be at risk of having or have had a head injury, and they don't even know it. So we know that on average, 1 out of 2 head injuries results in a major mood disorder. So the hypothesis is that a lot of these suicides, in part, could really be the downstream effects of some type of head injury. And when you understand how neuroinflammation and the downregulation of key hormones directly can lead to depression or anxiety or OCD or bipolar or any of these other mood disorders, then it starts to make kind of sense. So if you can then treat somebody who, even though they don't think they've ever had a head injury, if we can address the inflammation, replenish the chemistry that's not being made anymore, individuals seem to get better, even though they're not aware of a head injury in their past history.
Most of us assume that a major mood disorder is psychological, but what I'm hearing is that it could be physical. What's going on in the brain, and how do we fix it?
In trauma, you have these inflammatory chemicals being produced. So they disrupt the chemistry of the brain. So what do we want to do? We want to fix that. So the way you fix it is you stop the inflammation. And we have means which can downregulate this inflammatory process. And what happens is you get a return in the quality of life that you've lost through this trauma.
I think as of 2017, 46 million adult Americans had a major mood disorder. And if the current treatment methodology for that is psychotherapy and medication, and people are continuing to get worse, then maybe we're not asking the right questions or are going about it the right way.
I have a medic, Army medic, who would walk behind Abramson tanks when he was out in the field of battle. And he'd use the tank as his barrier, his defense. And they would discharge their rounds, and he'd get this blast wave. Not a scratch on his body. He did his tour of duty, and retired and ended up at the VA in San Diego. And within 18 months of his separation from the military, he started developing depression, issues with libido, headaches, just moodiness, just didn't feel right. And so obviously he was started on a group of antidepressant medications, mood elevators, stimulants, and what have you. And when he ended up coming to the office, because these products, these medications were not working, they were actually making him a little bit worse. So when we ran his biomarkers, 30 biomarkers, it turned out that he had 2.5, 2 full and 1 partial hormonal deficiencies. And when we put him onto the hormones as well as the anti-inflammatory regimen, he got better.
I think a lot of it has to do with there is a disruption in the continuity of the brain's functioning. And that, I don't know, I'm not saying it's the only factor, but I'm saying it's a contributing one for sure. And I think a lot of the suicides have to do with that. Military, it's easy to make that correlation just because of the demands of the job. Shooting a gun repetitively over years is going to cause subconcussive blasts. Being in some difficult environments that aren't conducive to regeneration, healing, going back to the environment that you need to heal from things like that. So you don't get the chance to kind of come back from some of these situations that you're exposed to in the military. So I think in large part that has a lot to do with it. And we're just now trying to really understand, the breadth and depth of that.
There's a theory out of USC, which is called the neuroendocrine theory of aging, which is what I ascribe to 100%. Caleb Finch, Dr. Caleb Finch, developed this years ago, 20 years ago, if not longer. And what he said is the reason why we age is because we lose the hormones that regulate everything in our body, and that's here in the brain. It's not the ones below the neck, it's the ones that are generated in the brain. So the benefits are in identifying the underlying causes, and that's the biochemical tests or the biomarkers, and then applying the science of treatment. And it's not medicinal. 80 to 90% of what we do are naturopathic products, real medicines. Because I know they're real medicines because you can't walk into a pharmacy or into a GNC or a health food in Canada, United Kingdom, Australia, Germany, outside the United States. You can't walk into a health food store and pick up something as simple as pregnenolone or DHEA. In these countries, you need a pharmacist, you need a doctor to prescribe it. And that's why they're suffering like they are.
It's not surprising that there are as many different treatments for trauma as there are causes of it. But what surprises me is that according to the CDC, more than 60% of American adults experience trauma as children. I know this is your story. Can you share with us?
So I grew up in what I imagined to be a really happy home. I thought that's how everybody else lived. When I think back, and I think about a little girl who dreams about what she wants to be when she grows up, I realize that from the age of 5 till, believe it or not, the age of 50, I was figuring out how I wanted to be. It was very important to me to be a good little girl. It wasn't worth not being good. I was good not because I was so virtuous, because I was afraid not to be. The messages I got were very much tied to the importance of being beautiful. In order to be beautiful, you needed to be thin, very thin. So put that together with my perfectionistic personality, my desire to please, my fear of what food would do to me, which morphed out of a lot of experiences. It was the perfect recipe for an eating disorder.
When we look at things like eating disorders, bulimia, anorexia, what we're finding is a very high correlation with anxiety disorder preceding an eating disorder. Now, it is not in any way, shape, or form 100%. There are many factors that may lead someone to an eating disorder. But we do have that information that so often those two are linked, and the anxiety disorder has its own physiology within the body.
If I hate my body, if I'm speaking ill of myself, which a lot of humans do, there's a constant dialogue going on in the head. You're not good enough. People look in the mirror. Women do this a lot. They're looking in the mirror and they're attacking themselves. As soon as the brain senses attack, we go into stress response. Now, stress response is a graded response. So you could have a full-blown stress response. You could have a very small stress response. Point is, when you and I are hyper-producing cortisol and insulin on a daily basis because of all that stress, especially the self-chosen stress, cortisol and insulin will signal the body, in a majority of cases, to store weight, store fat, and not build muscle.
As dietitians, a lot of times our clients will think it's just really interesting that instead of just focusing on the food, a lot of people come to us and just want to focus on their food. We're actually going to go into techniques like prayer and meditation and journaling and really getting them to feel. We've found that with trauma, releasing it, you've got to feel in order to heal. And if they're not actually paying attention to their emotions and tapping into how their body is feeling, the trauma is not going to be released. So those are some of the most effective techniques that we find to help them connect with their body. Even just meditation can be so difficult for someone who's been trying to avoid their feelings and avoid their emotions, because it can be really scary, because sometimes we just don't know what's going to come up when we actually face ourselves and, tap inward and see what's actually coming up for us. So we really guide them through this process of just being still and patient and accepting their feelings that come up, whatever it is. And that's really how you get that trauma out of the body.
By the time I was 12, I was introduced to my first diet. And I have to say that not everybody who goes on a diet is going to develop an eating disorder, but there's never been somebody with an eating disorder that didn't start with a diet. So I started to count calories, and that morphed into me counting fat grams, and then it became the 70s, so I started counting carbohydrate grams. And while I was so good at calculating the nutrient value of everything I was putting in my mouth, I couldn't balance a checkbook. And this was a time in my life where I could have been experiencing the most wondrous growth. I was a new wife. I became a mother to 2 daughters. And again, I was just figuring out how to be. I was fulfilling the prophecy that was laid out for me and living that dream.
I think what's really interesting is the connection between trauma and our way of eating, because sometimes we can't control something. Like if there's this trauma that's happened in the past, it's something that we can't control, and we try to control something else. So a lot of times we see our clients will try to control their eating, which might end up turning into some sort of restrictive eating disorder or even just restrictive eating patterns, because they're trying to grasp onto what they can. And another thing is people will oftentimes use food as a coping mechanism or a numbing mechanism, and without actually addressing the underlying trauma in your body, without actually feeling into that and healing that, it can just be this vicious cycle then of trying to control and restrict food intake, and then that can cause more stress on the body, and the stress that you're causing on your body can increase your cortisol levels, and the increase in cortisol can cause weight gain. So then you try to control even more, and it just turns into this vicious cycle that's really difficult to get out of without actually dealing with the underlying trauma.
I'm hearing that unhealthy weight loss or weight gain is often associated with some early trauma. Have you seen that in your practice?
I first started learning about trauma because I had to. Clients would come to see me, and I'd listen to their story. We call it a history. I prefer to say story because everybody's got a story. And there's a significant number of humans who are weight loss resistance. No matter what they do, they can't lose weight. And it's more than you might think. And I started to wonder, what the heck is going on? Because if you look at their, are they insulin resistant? Do they have a thyroid issue? No. And there's a lot of them. And I started noticing in people's stories who had long-term weight loss resistance that oftentimes there's a history of traumatic events. And what I mean by trauma is sexual abuse. is physical abuse, is emotional abuse that often comes in the form of, when I was a child, I kept getting the message, you're no good, you're too fat, you need to be this, you need to be that, you're a girl, you're not a boy, whatever it is. But there's messages coming from outside of that child's mind that's telling it, you're not okay. Now, if somebody tells me today I'm not okay, not a problem. But tell me when I'm 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and that for many small humans can register as a trauma, meaning an undigested stressor that's pretty intense.
When I was 47 years old, my husband, who I had married when I was 21, was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And that battle took us into a good 21 months. And Stuart lost his battle with metastatic melanoma in August of 2004. And I have to say that catapulted me into the darkest time of my life. And I'm not proud of how I chose to cope. I had 2 daughters who were grown women at that time. They were 23 and 25. And there were times that I imagined that they thought the wrong parent died. I guess that was my trauma. After all, I felt betrayed. I was supposed to have this golden life. What happened to this picture that was laid out before me? It was stripped away from me as though somebody ripped a tablecloth out from under a beautifully set table, because my life was a beautifully set table. So that was 2004. 2005, I walked into the rooms of AA because what was once social drinking for me stopped being fun. And the wine essentially became my lover.
The other aspect of that is the connection with trauma. And so with the trauma, there can be that numbing, that sense of shutting down, or that can happen through eating disorders, it can happen through addictions, it can happen through many, many kinds of behaviors, right? And so the trauma, as it's being re-experienced over and over again, is so painful in how it feels for so many people, that this is a strategy to shut it down, things like eating disorders and addictions.
I knew at that time I had a choice, and it was about acceptance, compassion, and forgiveness. And not only did I have to forgive myself, but I had to forgive the experiences of my life that got me to that point, and that brought me to my knees. And I decided I was going to climb out of that hole.
Andrew's stories of violent trauma experienced while serving the armed forces obviously sounds like big T trauma. Mindy's lifetime story of sustained little t traumas until the loss of her husband carries a different flavor. But what they both have in common is a delayed, self-destructive response to their trauma. The path towards healing is making that connection between a behavioral disorder, such as substance abuse, relationship problems, suicidal thoughts, and your trauma. Let's recap what we just learned. Trauma affects us on a cellular level. It can literally change the way our mind thinks and how our body works. Everyone experiences trauma differently. Our individual response to traumatic events of any kind is our resilience. The intensity of trauma is always relative, but that doesn't diminish its impact. Trauma always takes a mental toll on us. Often its effect lasts long after the traumatic incident. The first step to recovery is to recognize the trauma. Identify the way it's affected your behavior, and then start on the road to healing and recovery.
We hope you're enjoying this episode, and we're going to dive back into it in just a moment. But I want to take a moment and tell you how you can access the entire series, plus several other films, series, and masterclasses. You may have noticed that you're watching the trauma series on our new dynamic streaming interface with an array of other titles and health topics further down this page. This is our Whole TV video platform, and for the duration of this series, you have a special viewing period for the Healing Trauma docuseries for free. But this access will expire in a few days once this premiere ends. Not to worry. If you want continued access to this series and every one of the other powerful healing videos on this platform, simply click the button below and we'll give you a special discount on a Whole TV subscription. Every month, we add and create new titles to the Whole TV catalog, including films, series like this one, and lots of live programming. We cannot wait for you to witness Whole TV and the hours of transformative documentaries, masterclasses, live workshops we've created for you. Thank you for your support, and now back to our episode.
You know, with social media at everyone's fingertips, we're constantly being bombarded by the highlight reels of people's personal and professional achievements. Folks rarely expose the gritty and perhaps difficult behind-the-scenes moments. We only see the good stuff.
So true. I'm just happy most of my epic fails have been relegated to old-fashioned photo albums and scar tissue, frankly.
There are some things the world does not need to see.
Absolutely. But the truth is, the challenging moments we face in life, those fails, if you will, that's where the real work gets done.
And it's what leads us to growth. Breaking through the pain of trauma is a cathartic moment that can be a beautiful and profound experience. But seeing that light is hard when you can't see through the darkness. Let's join Pedram for our discussion on these breakthrough moments.
Everybody handles trauma differently, but the moment we finally recognize and confront the symptoms of our trauma, that's when the journey starts towards healing. It's usually marked by a common event: hitting rock bottom. In this segment, we're going to hear more from Andrew and Mindy and how their respective traumas led them both to their own rock bottom moments. And in that flash of pain and vulnerability, they both experienced the breakthrough that forever changed their lives for the better.
So my wife was pregnant with our fifth child at the time. So we went to go and pick up her mother-in-law because she's coming in to help, because Becky was due that week. So when we went to go pick her up, our son Jace had a respiratory infection, the week prior. So he was coughing, things like that. He's 13 months at the time. Now he had a genetic condition called a lymphatic malformation. So he had like this kidney bean size type of growth in his neck. And there wasn't much more to it than that. It was just kind of there. It wasn't causing him any harm. We didn't expect anything to happen. But when we left from leaving our house in the Washington state, going to the airport to pick up our mother-in-law and coming back, so maybe 3 hours time, by the time we got back to our house and I went to go get Jace out of his car seat, his neck had ballooned up to the size of a softball. So in like less than 3 hours time, just became huge. So it was like, okay, well, we got to go to the emergency room right now. So luckily my mother-in-law was able to stay there with the rest of the kids. Now, meanwhile, prior to going to the airport, I've been having this horrible cramping, or not cramping, but calf pain in my leg, in my left leg. And I just thought I had strained my calf.
In some ways, trauma is in the eye of the beholder. So if I go through something and in my own mind I see it as a horrible thing that was done to me, then I might identify it as a trauma in my life.
So we got Jace. Okay, he's in a pretty dire situation. So we go to the emergency room and try to get him triaged and cared for. At the meantime, my calf is killing me. So I'm saying, hey, while we're here, can we do anything for this? Just give me a shot or something to make the pain go away. At that time, Becky starts to go into labor, with the son, with our fifth son. So we're all triaged in the same ER room, emergency room.
There are also traumas that people go through, and they go, "Oh, it wasn't a big deal," except it was a big deal because they continue to behave in ways that and have patterns in life or habits in life that are a reflection of what they went through when they were much younger.
Jace is deemed like he's got to go into emergency surgery, so they take him up to like the 5th floor, I think it was, to do that. Meanwhile, Becky goes into labor, so they take her to the 3rd floor so she can give labor. And I'm trying to bounce back and forth between the 3rd floor and the 5th floor, being there for both of them. So Jace is about to go into emergency surgery. He's 13 months old, on his neck. Becky's given birth to our son, and meanwhile, I'm just in excruciating pain. So like I'm going between the 3rd and the 5th floor, and my leg like it's not working at this point. So I'm just kind of dragging it with me to get up and down there. So I'm with Jace until he goes under. They put him under with anesthesia, and they operate on his neck, try to alleviate some of the problems there. Go down, was able to be there to witness my son's birth at that point. And after they were both kind of, in a safe and secure environment, Jace had his surgery, he was good to go. Becky and our newborn son were good to go. They finally, the medical staff, convinced me that we needed to do some imaging on my leg. So we then went and did some imaging on the leg, and it showed that I had this blood clot that had broken off from my leg and it traveled to both lungs. It's called a bilateral pulmonary embolism. And so at this point they were like, this is a very high mortality rate, and we got a very short time window here that we can break this up. And so I had to go into the ICU to receive, emergency care to break up the blood clot. So all 3 of us were there in the hospital all at the same time for all these different things. And so me and Jason ended up having to stay in the hospital for a couple of weeks after that. But we all got through it. But it was definitely a traumatic event on all of us.
When somebody's experienced a trauma, it's not that somebody necessarily collapses once they've been through a trauma. There's some literature in the psychology field that talks about what we call post-traumatic growth. When somebody experiences a trauma, there are opportunities for people to actually evolve and grow from the experience, rather than to collapse or feel horrible based on the experience that they went through. And when somebody, again, is able to make sense of what the experience is, they're able to extract the good, they're able to take something that they learned from it, then different aspects of their life can change. They may see life in a more open sort of way. They may hold a different philosophy about life, and they're more willing to engage in life in a way that they hadn't been before. Their perception of themselves change. They start to see themselves as being more capable or more emotionally strong, that they went through this hard time and now they're able to kind of evolve into a better person.
When all those things happened at the hospital before, and my boy Jace had all those different surgeries, it was at his last surgery, and I'm there with him, and he's recovering in the ICU. And I just came to this crystal clear understanding, this moment of clarity. It's like my life was basically at this crossroads as I understood it, and it was going to go one of 2 ways. And I could continue on the same path that I was on, the path that the military medical system had put me on, and the one that I kept blaming essentially for all my problems. But as I looked down at my boy, I realized probably for the first time that I was of absolutely no value to him or my family in the condition I was in. So the only place that was taking me, as I saw it, was towards an early grave. So right then and there, I just thought that's not an option. So the other option, as I saw it, was to revert back to my most foundational level of training. And so I was going to, from that point, I was going to embrace this current level of pain, but instead I wanted to channel it correctly and act on it. And my focus became at that time to improve my situation.
I love this concept of post-traumatic growth. I think it's so beautiful. I once learned this incredibly beautiful thing about our planet. Many billions of years ago, the Earth actually was not tilted on its axis. It was just straight up and down. And then a huge asteroid hit the Earth and knocked it slightly off kilter. And that's why we have seasons. So this trauma that happened to the Earth actually allowed us to have flowers bloom in spring. And I love that as a metaphor for the way that we can make use of our traumas now.
We've been talking about post-traumatic growth. In your story, you faced your eating disorder and sought treatment. What was recovery like for you, and what was going through your mind? What did it take for you to move forward?
When I got my knees back, I discovered the Institute for Integrative Nutrition, and I decided I wanted to become a certified health coach. And I was going to have credentials and all the information I knew about nutrition, because one thing about people with eating disorders, they nerd out on nutrition. I was going to put to good use, and I was going to help a lot of people. And it put me on this unbelievable trajectory, something that became bigger than me. And through that program, I discovered Mark David and the Institute for the Psychology of Eating and became a certified eating psychology coach. From there, I discovered the Functional Nutrition Alliance and my teacher and beloved mentor, Andrea Nakayama, who taught me all about the systems of the body and functional nutrition and how everything is connected, how everybody is unique, and how everything matters. And I put all that training together with my extensive life experience, and I created this program that I believe is going to change lives.
It's so common to have a food issue, a dysfunctional relationship with food after betrayal, because think about why we're using it. We're using it to numb, avoid, or distract ourselves from something we're not willing to face or feel. Betrayal's hard. So what we do is, it's like when we were kids, remember how we would stick our fingers in our ear, no, la, 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 I don't hear you. When we're using food, drugs, alcohol, work, TV, keeping busy, it's the adult version of that same game. So there's something that's calling our attention, something that we're meant to face or feel, and we don't want to. So food is perfect because it's going to distract us from it until it can't.
So here I am trying to get my message out there, impact change, be a change maker, change the paradigm of eating disorder recovery, because the conventional method speaks to a one-size-fits-all diet, whereas they're talking about the gut-brain connection. They're not putting together that what we're feeding our bodies is feeding our brains, and that the very food that is being given to these patients to restore their weight or control their weight or impact their behaviors is actually feeding their anxiety. And I'm setting out to change that.
That's how transformation starts. It starts with decision. People think change takes time. Change happens in an instant. Seeing the results of the change takes time. Implementing it may take time. Change like this.
Your earliest trauma manifested into an eating disorder. What do you remember about how it started, and what was the initial sense of comfort it brought you?
Eating disorders start out as a solution, right? Start out as adaptive behaviors in order to feel safe and secure. Very often what happens is the sufferer is totally disassociating from her body, checking out, not wanting to feel anything associated with her body. Generally speaking, what starts out as a solution, adaptive behavior in an effort to self-soothe, feel safe, essentially becomes maladaptive behaviors. And the person could be self-soothing in order to avoid feeling, self-soothing in a way to feel protected, self-soothing in a way to isolate, self-soothe in a way to be punitive, not feel they're worthy, therefore I don't deserve to eat, or I need to eat in an effort not to feel.
There is a powerful, powerful hidden connection between body image and trauma, and it largely goes unexamined. Now, a lot of people who have a negative body image, they believe that it's my problem. I've got a poor body image, you have a poor body image, it's your problem, fix it. And what most people don't understand is it's actually not your problem. You didn't invent that problem. You're actually born into it. So if you look around, and even if you don't look around, the world tells you. The world tells you how you should view your body. For young men, look at every comic book hero, look at every movie, look at every superstar guy, look at every athlete, they're all big and strong. For women, look at all the Disney princesses. They're all skinny and young and pretty.
So the sufferer figures out that I can control my body, I can check out of my body using these behaviors. But there is research that's pointing to the depth of certain trauma affecting eating disorders on a certain level. In other words, if the trauma is extremely severe, then the eating disorder will be more severe and the person will be less likely to recover. Only 50% of people with eating disorders actually experience full recovery.
I actually have 4 questions I ask people to see if they're numbing and distracting, because you can't change what you're not aware of. So the first would be, are you numbing and distracting? If so, how? I mean, be honest with yourself. Do you come home and is the first thing you do put the TV on because you desperately do not want to hear what's in your own head? Or are you eating? Here's a big question. What am I pretending not to see? Are you pretending not to see there's trouble in your relationship? Are you pretending not to see that health issue that needs your attention? Are you pretending not to see that you hate your job?
Look at the most brilliant psychologists on the planet who are all employed by industry, by the corporations. Those psychologists are telling you how to market to people. And the way you get people to buy something, especially women, is you tell them you're not good enough. And then you offer them a solution for it. So you watch just about any beauty-related product, any health-related product for women. It's all tied into, on some level, you ain't good enough. You're not lovable as you are. So here I am, here we are, we're growing up, whether you're male or female, you have these imprinted images that you didn't invent that you're getting from everywhere. You're being inundated with how you're supposed to be, and you look around and you go, damn, that's not me.
The diet culture wreaks havoc on us. I say all the time that the nutritional confusion is a new eating disorder. All the media bombardment of eat this, don't eat that, the demonization of the wellness diets. People have so many choices, they don't know what to do for themselves. But again, that happens when we are in our heads, when we're not connected to the wisdom of our bodies, when we're not listening to what our bodies truly need, when we attach ourselves to an influencer, right? And we say, well, she's moving this way, she's exercising this way, she's eating this way, she's dressing this way. And the need to measure up to that perceived image can be devastating to somebody that has a negative self-image. And that in itself can be traumatizing to somebody that doesn't have the self-esteem and the wherewithal to figure out what's right for her.
Now, what a lot of the females of the world do is they go, well, that's not me, and I'm screwed, but if I diet and exercise, then maybe I can get into the cool kid place. Then maybe I can be loved and accepted. So then we diet and exercise like crazy so we can get there. And we're being driven by, I'm not good enough. So a lot of people, on the outside, it looks like they're doing good things. They're exercising. They're eating, gluten-free, healthy, organic food, but they're being driven by, you're no good. I'm not good enough. My body's not good enough. That's a stressor. That's a major stressor because my body is me. And especially the world is telling you your body is your billboard. And that better be a good billboard, better be a good advertisement. Because if it's not, you're in trouble.
Healing from trauma, it's a process, whether big T or little t. And there's no one-size-fits-all solution, right? But when we find that healing process that works for us, how do we get past the pain and use it to better ourselves?
Sometimes when we get the gift of pain, It can open up new caverns of possibility within ourselves. If we struggle with something, the release of coming out on the other side can be so pleasurable and so profound. Think about the last time you got sick and you were in bed for several days and your body just felt awful. And then that day you woke up and you felt better. And you take a shower and the water feels so good on your body. And you're like, oh my God, I'm so happy to be alive. And you feel so tenderly toward your body and you appreciate it so much in a way that you didn't before you got sick. Trauma can be like that too. It can help us become more connected to ourselves and to life. It can teach us spiritual lessons. It can allow us the art of forgiveness, compassion, and grace.
In order to fully transform, we need to stop thinking about what we need to do to change. True transformation, emerging on the other side, climbing out of a black hole, however you need to define it in your mind, comes from when we let go of what is no longer serving us. That's true transformation. Transformation is about what we can be. It's about being the change. It's not about what we can do. It's about what we can be. Be the change, live the change, and ultimately see the change.
We are so grateful for Andrew and Mindy's courage to share their stories. Change is disruptive, and it's also painful, but it's also inevitable. You know, there's a misconception that trauma is shameful or a sign of weakness. But in reality, the change we experience from trauma is often the source of our greatest strength. Let's recap some of the pitfalls of trauma and the first step in finding our way out of the cycle and achieving growth. Post-traumatic stress leaves us feeling withdrawn or numb to life. Substance abuse, belligerence, and eating disorders are short-term solutions to trauma. Many people use these to regain a sense of control. Short-term solutions only provide temporary relief. In the long run, they can lead to even more stress, anxiety, and physical health issues. Trauma is an opportunity for growth. If we recognize our trauma and connect it to our behavior, we can experience post-traumatic growth. This not only increases our resilience, it also provides a new sense of purpose in life. Andrew and Mindy courageously shared some of their darkest moments with us. It was during those rock bottom moments that they both had an epiphany about their trauma.
For Mindy, a lifetime of emotional trauma as a child fostered a distorted image of perfection, which manifested itself in different ways.
Eating disorders are a common symptom of childhood trauma. Mindy's concept of perfection was challenged even more when her husband passed away.
The loss of her storybook life created so much trauma that she turned to substance abuse. This negatively affected her relationship with her children.
And for Andrew, the physical and emotional stress he experienced in combat led him down a path of self-destructive behavior that was so extreme. I mean, he thought his family would be better off without him.
Andrew was clearly in so much distress, and look what it took to get him on a path of healing.
A wild series of traumatic events that landed half his family in the hospital, including a near-death experience for himself. Only then did he realize he had to address the root of his behavioral disorders. Look, human beings are resilient. We are the product of millions of years of evolution and adaptation. It's what we do. But when it comes to trauma, we tend to get stuck, and that hinders our potential for growth. Here's Nick with a segment about that struggle from those who faced it.
Life moves fast in the 21st century, and most of us are programmed to avoid things that are difficult. That includes spiritual and emotional growth. It's easier to bury our trauma than it is to face it, but at what cost? All too often, we don't take action to address our trauma until the symptoms have overwhelmed us. In this next segment, we'll look at the struggles people endure when they hang on to or adapt to their trauma. You'll also see the small steps to recognize and do something about your trauma before it takes full control of your body and your life.
I am one of 3 sisters, grew up in the same home. We each have a different memory of what home life was like. We each have a different relationship with our parents. We each see our parents differently. I was the firstborn to very young parents. They basically went to school on me. Then I had another sister born 2.5 years later. She has a whole different perception of what life was like in the home. And then we had a third sister who at 9 months old was diagnosed with a genetic disease. And the prognosis was not good. And it changed the entire trajectory of the family. But we all reacted differently. It was how we each perceived it. Now, I could look back and say that this was a traumatic event, and I think it was when I analyzed certain parts of my life. But it's the awareness and it's the ability to speak about it, the ability to work out and not let it stay in the body, that allows you to be resilient and not experience physiological injury.
I look at trauma in 2 different ways. The psychology field describes something called big T trauma and little t trauma. Big T trauma are the traumas that involve things like experiencing or witnessing something that's really a direct assault on you. So it could be situations, we certainly know war can foster trauma. Somebody who's been held at gunpoint fosters trauma. Abuse, sexual, physical, emotional abuse, they trigger trauma or they can elicit trauma. Little t trauma is considered kind of the humiliations, embarrassments, and rejections that people go through. So not being included in a play group, not being included in a social peer group, those kinds of things might be a little t trauma.
There's a lot of small traumas, and those small traumas can add up for us. And the trauma called, here I am in this world, but I'm not lovable. That's a low-level, unnoticed trauma. And people are walking around like we're okay, that we're normal, but inside. And I meet people who you might look at and say, wow, this person has a great body. They have good looks. They could have the perfect body according to everybody and the perfect looks, and they can still hate themselves. They could still be suicidal. The looks don't even guarantee you anything. You probably know someone like that. Yeah, he, she, they got everything, and they're still unhappy. So that stress is that self-chosen stress that we've caught from the world, not your fault, is living in the body. And it's firing off and creating a biochemical milieu that, again, signals the body to hold on to weight, hold on to fat, not build muscle, don't digest efficiently, don't regulate calorie burning metabolism in a consistent way. Those are some interesting messages to give a body, and then people are taking digestive aids and wondering why it doesn't make them feel better. So in a lot of ways, I think trauma can point us towards really, it's like a spiritual path. Healing from trauma is a spiritual path.
As someone who has recovered from an eating disorder and experienced emotional trauma and loss, what are some of the main themes you think are important to help your clients start the recovery process?
If you're a child growing up, looking back at trauma, what can I do to let go in order to fully transform? Because if you're a child, of course, what was your role? You know, unfortunately, you were delivered to the wrong situation by the universe. But there is a lot of guilt with people who have suffered from trauma. Very often that was the perfect storm, the perfect recipe, no pun intended, for an eating disorder, because it starts out as a form of protection. So forgiveness of yourself is essential, but it's a process to get there.
Sometimes just making a connection between my unwanted symptom and something that happened back then, just making that connection is in and of itself a powerful healing force. Oh, that's why I do that. I'm not just some rotten, disgusting, terrible, broken person. There's a brilliant reason rooted somewhere in biology or psychology or both as to why I have this unwanted behavior, as to why I have this unwanted symptom.
The power of mindset is amazing. And to realize that you are here for a reason, and to be blessed with the mindset that you experienced what you experienced, as horrific as it might have been, as grievous as it might have been, as betrayed as you might have felt, you got to the other side. And that can be a beautiful lesson. And what are you going to do with it? You're here, you're breathing, and it can be a gift when you know how to embrace it. And most people that I encounter that have experienced this, and I know myself, want to pay it forward, are so grateful to be on the other side of that trauma.
How did your view on life change as you recovered? What changes did you notice within yourself?
So even at that time that I had a short-circuiting brain and a malfunctioning body, you know, I just came to understand that I was going to receive, internalize, and process, you know, circumstances differently. So it was right there at his bedside that I promised him and myself three things. One, that I would return to the man of my pre-injury status. The second one was that I would find a way to come off all the medication that I was on. And once those two things were accomplished, the third thing was we were going to figure out how to turn around to help somebody else do the exact same thing. So really what was, I thought was the worst thing in my life turned out has now been one of the best things in my life, because it challenged my ways of thinking and certain assumptions I had about things, and I had to go out and look for new answers. So essentially I had to change, you know, my mindset.
Talk therapy is not always the answer when it comes to healing trauma, basically because if the symptoms are showing up physiologically in the body and the patient is talking about the problem, they're in their heads. We need them to experience the body. They don't see their bodies the way the world sees them. They don't feel their bodies the way God meant us to. So it's very important to introduce them to therapies that help them feel embodied so they can inhabit what they have to and in a healthy way purge what they're holding on to.
Again, I was kind of out of my own trials and tribulations back there at my son's hospital bed, where I said, if we can get on the other side of this, I want my new mission in life to figure out how we can help other people to do the same thing. You know what I mean? And so my brother and I started the Warrior Angels Foundation in 2015. So my brother Adam was an Apache helicopter aviation commander in the Army. So he resigned his commission in the Army, gave a promotion to help me start up this organization. And essentially we made Dr. Gordon's treatment option available to both service members and veterans, you know, who had sustained a head injury in the line of combat. That's the whole mission of the Warrior Angels Foundation. And as maybe a sub-mission was to better bring about the education on what can cause a head injury, but more importantly, like what are all the symptomatologies of a head injury, because oftentimes we'll take the symptoms as the problem, and those are not really the problem. It's a subset of a much bigger problem. And so we've been able to kind of bring that education and awareness into the community as well.
No one intentionally invites trauma into their life, But as a therapist, do you think there are specific types of people or personality traits that recover easier from trauma than others?
There may be people who have a degree of resilience coming into a situation. Let's say they have people that they can turn to, and rather than isolate, they go talk to those people. When they get concerned that they're experiencing something different from what they did before following the trauma, and they reach out and they seek resources to help them with that, those types of people are likely to bounce back and move through the trauma more easily, and then be able to be much more effective in life again. Whereas some people who isolate, they don't talk. Again, it's going to be, or they experienced many prior traumas where they, let's say they came from a family where there was chaos or there was abuse, and then they experienced something similar down the line. Then the trauma in the present could activate the trauma from the past. So they may feel less skillful and less able to actually make their way through the trauma.
We can't necessarily control anything in life. I think we can control maybe two things, our attitude and our effort. So it's hard to understand why things happen, especially if it was a traumatic experience. But if you're able to elevate your internal state to be greater than your external environment, we have this ability to rise above that, and maybe even potentially, as Viktor Frankl would say, to find meaning in the most difficult and trying of circumstances. And I absolutely, that resonates with me. Because it'd be very easy to say, you know, I've been through all these difficult situations. I think the easiest thing to be would just give up. That would just have ruined everything that I love. So not only do I have this amazing family, I have this amazing mission where now we've been able to help thousands of people understand their traumas and how to deal with them and how to actually get better. So I think I said it before, but I really mean it. What I thought was the worst thing in my life, it's turned out to be one of the best. It's through these things, I think it is absolutely a gift. I think as humans, like, things just, they just are. We could attach a certain narrative to it, you know what I mean? And once you understand that, all you have to do is to change your story, change your perspective, and align to a higher, an elevated, platform, an elevated way of thinking, an elevated way of being, you realize that not only can you do that when times are good, we have the ability to do that in any situation, even some of the most difficult times throughout humanity. And so I think I'm living proof that what we think as trauma can be turned into a very beneficial scenario that can have rippling effects that are even hard to understand.
The idea that we all carry a personal narrative with us is powerful in its simplicity. We become attached to our personal stories, but what's a story without a plot twist? Trauma is just that. It's a change to our story that we're not expecting. The conflicts that arise and how you face them not only determines the kind of story you live, it can change the entire story for the better. Here are some key takeaways from this segment. Trauma in life is inevitable. Experiencing trauma has nothing to do with your value as a human being. Healing is a spiritual journey, and the first step is forgiving yourself. Having someone to talk to about your trauma is effective in moving on from your pain. It's our ability to recognize and embrace our emotional trauma that helps us evolve. Often, this leads to spiritual growth and fuller well-being. We are all here for a reason, and identifying your trauma can help you identify that purpose. The journey towards healing starts with you, but you don't have to do it in the dark. Our experts are here to guide you through your traumatic healing, and we are blessed to have them. This series gives you unprecedented access to their wisdom and insights. Subscribing to Whole TV also gives you access to the full uncut interviews and a special companion piece packed with powerful science, wisdom, and insight, all designed to help you navigate your way toward overcoming your trauma. Please take a moment to subscribe now so you can have access to this information and all of the bonus resources available for this limited time. Fitness, yoga, self-care, masterclasses, and much more will keep coming your way, all designed to support your betterment. Join Whole TV now and get a deep discount with an annual plan. Thank you.
Everyone's trauma is as unique as their own individuality, so the paths to overcoming trauma are equally infinite.
So much so that we'll continue this theme in our next episode, focusing on emotional trauma and the journey to recover and evolve.
Talk therapy, physical therapy, spiritual practices. All of these are avenues one can take to come out whole on the other side of trauma. The paths are infinite, and so are the solutions.
We hope this episode has enlightened you to better understand emotional trauma and perhaps emboldened you to take those first steps to turn trauma into triumph. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you next time.